My name is David Bradshaw. I'm a senior vice president at Govini, and I run the Army Air Force accounts. With 30 years of active duty in the Army, I fully understand the data and system problems that exist. Whether it was my time at Force 21, where the Army was trying to digitize the battlefield, or my time at JIDO, where we're fighting counter IEDs, expanding the limits of data in network analysis and data analytics on our homegrown backroom Hadoop stack, or whether it was my time at the Army's AI task force, where we're bringing autonomy and AI to the battlefield. It is clear that the battlefield is ever changing, and the Army and the department have to keep pace. As the United States looks forward to the future battlefield, they'll have to grapple with what requirements are the right requirements, who are the right partners to deal with those requirements, and how do we ensure that we rapidly innovate and bring those capabilities to the battlefield at the quickest pace possible. I'm super excited to introduce this next panel who will answer those questions and discuss the transformation of the battlefield into the future. Today we have esteemed panelist in General Jim Rainey, who's the Army Futures Command Commander, Shyam Sankar, who is the Chief Technology Officer at Palantir, and Brose, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at Anduril. They'll be guided through discussion by our very own Tara Murphy Dougherty, who is the CEO at Govini. Welcome.
First of all, thanks to all three of you for joining me here on stage. I'm looking forward to this. This, depending on how honest you're going to be, could be a very, very fun conversation. One of the things that certainly permeates this discourse and these debates is, I think, a negativity. And certainly I'm guilty of it. If you heard my opening remarks, you think the sky is falling. And I do think that the picture is bleak right now, but I'm not convinced we should give up hope. And so would love to start by just hearing from the three of you. And General Rainey, if I could start with you, that would be great. When you think about the future of the battlefield, what is there to be optimistic about? And from your vantage point in Austin, leading Army Futures Command, do you see things that are working?
Yeah, well, thanks. First of all, thanks for including me on an awesome panel, great teammates, important topic. Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of urgency. The world's dangerous, a lot of negative trends, but I am in the sum and optimistic. One, because people don't follow people around the battlefield if they're pessimists, so I'm kind of in favor of being an optimist. But the biggest thing is war, and you've seen this play out in spades in Ukraine and Gaza and there's a lot of things changing, but there are also things that are not changing about war. And war at its bare, most basic thing is a contest of will between human beings. And that is where we have a gigantic asymmetric advantage over China or anybody else. Our people are phenomenal. We have an all-volunteer force. We have a non-commissioned officer corps that nobody is ever going to be able to buy. We got leaders at scale. We got men and women commanding our formations that are phenomenally talented. So whatever we do transformation-wise, I believe we need to sustain our people advantage. I think that transcends into the tech sector. Not an expert, but we absolutely should be able and can out-innovate anybody in the world in the United States. So I'm an optimist about that. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope so.
Well, Shyam, what do you think? Are you more optimistic about the future or pessimistic?
Having done this for roughly 20 years now, I would say I'm incredibly optimistic. I mean, when I think counterfactually, could we have had this conference 10 years ago? What would the constitution of the attendees have been like? So much has changed. The capital class has showed up in force. The entrepreneurs have showed up. The collaboration with the government has transformed. And I think we shouldn't conflate frustration, because we all care so much. We're all working so hard. If we weren't banging our heads against the wall, we wouldn't be doing it right. So we shouldn't conflate the frustration with the optimism that is so latently expressed in the fact that we wake up every day and collectively, government, industry, go after this together.
Excellent. Chris, do you share the view?
I would echo the chorus. And I think Shyam's point about the context is right. When I think back 5, 6, 7, 10 years ago when I was still in government, I saw Bob work around here. I remember, when he said China and great power competition in the same sentence and got reprimanded. We were trying to convince people to care about these kinds of problems, that software was actually important. Maybe we should build it and buy it differently from hardware. I left the Senate Armed Services Committee and joined Anduril Industries. People thought that I'd run off and join the circus. I think here we are, and sure, I think all of us want to be moving faster, but when you kind of look at the context, we largely agree on what the problem is. When you look at the National Defense Strategy as produced by the Trump administration and the Biden administration, they're pretty similar. Democrats and Republicans can't agree that the sky is blue and the grass is green, but they agree that China's the pacing threat, that we need new technology, we need new entrants, we need production at scale. These are good things, and obviously a lot of that's been pushed along by crises like Ukraine and Gaza and other things that are in the news. But no, net, I think this is moving in the right direction. I think I just echo what everybody else said. I think we just need to be doing more, doing faster, but absolutely the story is going in the right direction here.
Okay, excellent. Well, that gives me hope. So all three of you brought up technology, new entrants, and there's obviously a whole dynamic there. So Shyam, let me come back to you to start. And I alluded a little bit to this in my opening remarks, but I think it's fair to give Palantir quite a bit of credit for literally dragging DoD into the 21st century when it had no interest in being there. And today we're in a very different place where companies like Anduril and many other businesses are keen to work with DoD and in the national security sector on these challenges, which is wonderful. It is also evident to me that the department has not figured out at all what a new operating model looks like for collaborating with the traditional firms they're used to doing business with and this new category of defense companies. So I'd love to hear from you and Chris specifically about whether there's room for both. The traditional primes have a role to play. Clearly, these new companies are emerging for a reason and gaining some traction for a reason. Or is it a wholesale shift and the sun is setting on an old way of operating this defense industry and the sun is rising with a new way?
Yeah, that's a big question. Look, I think there's room for both, but I'm not saying that as some sort of political compromise. First of all, we have to manage the present reality of how are we going to equip the fighting force. You don't just like flip a bit to do that. I think we could think about this, what's actually happening, as a broader reversion to the mean. Once upon a time, Chrysler had a missile division. General Mills had a mechanics division that made artillery and inertial guidance systems. Like, it wasn't actually the defense industrial base, it was the American industrial base. And as a monopsonist buyer, particularly post-Cold War peace dividend, the department's gotten very comfortable essentially having and dealing with suppliers that are exclusively defense. And I think it's lost a lot of its ability to flex American might as a consequence. And the place, we're not the world's best at mass production anymore, but America is the world's best at software by a yawning margin. China doesn't, we think, obviously China, they're not technically unsophisticated, but they have 0 enterprise software companies in the commercial market. Think about what that means. There's more to software than simply, do I have the coders? They cannot compete in the market. Their internet companies only compete because they protected their market. Counterfactually, had they not, it would be American tech that dominates the Chinese consumer market. And so we need to, what we're seeing is the awkward reintegration of this American civil military fusion, where we're leveraging the greatest strength of our massively prosperous economy, software and technology, and reintegrating that into the industrial base.
Chris, do you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. When we look at our industrial base, there's absolutely going to be a need for traditional performers, traditional industry to continue to do the things that they're terrific at. In terms of, thinking about the future operating environments or even the current operating environments, there is going to continue to be a place for battleships, aircraft, tanks, artillery, these kinds of weapon systems. I think we're also not going to kind of move away into different kinds of systems. It's going to be this kind of old new, iteration moving forward, which is exactly, I think, what we've been seeing on the ground in Ukraine. I think what's different is the realization that the things that our traditional industrial base build, relatively small numbers of big, expensive, exquisite military systems, they're hard to produce. You can't buy very many of them. They don't go quickly. Are necessary but insufficient for military advantage now, to say nothing of the future. And what we need is the ability to augment those kinds of capabilities with larger and larger quantities of smaller, lower cost, more autonomous, more intelligent systems that you can mass produce. You can transfer, sell, provide to allies a lot easier and a lot faster. Systems that are essentially software-defined hardware, in the same way that a Tesla is a software-defined piece of hardware. And I think that's where you see it really playing to the strengths of different kinds of companies. So, yeah, in short, I think the answer is it's both. And then time will tell sort of what that force mix looks like based on the problems we're trying to solve. But that latter piece is the piece that I think we desperately need to bring up quickly, because that's going to provide the offsetting advantage vis-a-vis China, Russia, and our competitors.
Yeah, you said something really important in there, which was to point out the test bed that Ukraine has provided, not just in terms of capabilities and capability mix, but the kinds of companies that are building these capabilities and entering the fight, in some cases for the very first time. So, General Rainey, let's spend a minute on Ukraine. Are we learning the right lessons, and are we learning them fast enough?
Yeah, well, thanks. So, tragic, the human suffering and loss of life, but there's indisputably a responsibility to make sure we're learning from this and doing something about it. The Army has had lesson learned collection capability before that Russians actually even invaded. And we've been working real hard on it. And you got to take it with, it is a unique, the Russians and Ukrainians don't fight the way we do as a U.S. joint force. It's a geographically constrained nation state first proxy. But with all those caveats, the most disruptive thing with technology, in my opinion, is this, the reality that you can't hide. So technology dramatically favors the hunter versus the hider. So now you're going to be seen. And if you translate that to China, you're going to be seen by somebody that can hit anything he can see, right? Magazine depth plus precision. So the amount of disruption that in a sensor-laid ubiquitous battlefield against a good enemy that can hit what he sees, that is the most disruptive thing to land warfare. The good news is that just because you need to concede him seeing you, you can still contest his ability to understand what he's seeing. And there's a big opportunity because of the way the Chinese are moving towards telling their commanders what to do with technology. Vice the U.S. approach back to people, we're going to provide as much information as we can to our commanders, but still allow them to make the decision. So decision aided versus deciding for. I talked about what doesn't change. As long as people keep living on the land's going to matter. It comes down to people, urban warfare, close combat. There's a disruptive technology thing happening, but we should all remain cognizant of the fact that industrial age warfare is still a thing. Conventional HE artillery is the number one killer. War is nasty, it's hard, it's tragic. So those kind of things are informing our thinking about the future. Gaza, it's pretty early, tragic again. Shows that an over-reliance on technology, I'm big on integrating humans and machines in ways that optimize both of them. I think you can go too far down the over-reliance on technology, and it's just a matter of time till your opponent figures out a hole in your swing. The horrors of urban war, the importance of maintaining the high ground in the information dimension, those kind of things.
I think one thing that was absolutely evident and surprising, frankly, to a lot of people when Russia invaded Ukraine more than a year and a half ago, it was the first time in a long time that we saw a military power at the level of Ukraine, launch an attack like that and then be engaged in what ended up being sustained conflict. It still is sustained conflict. Anyway, the surprise was the conversation, at least in the United States, is so focused on the technological aspect of warfare. And yet all Americans were looking at the news and realizing warfare is also just brutal, and in some ways there's nothing technological about it, or it certainly wasn't, the technology wasn't at the forefront.
Yeah. Well, I think when I'm talking internal to members of the profession I'm in, what we say is, technology is increasing the punishment of unskilled leaders and commanders. So, it was never good to get into combat and not be good at what you're doing, but a mistake that would cost you 10% of your formation is now going to result in you losing your entire formation. So it's the old plus a much more lethality that's induced by the technology and the disruption.
I also think that the point about lack of, or actually the point about a completely unprecedented level of visibility that you were talking about, and the technology giving the advantage to the hunter, which is a good way of putting it, is a perfect example of a dynamic that we've thought about a lot at Govini, which is that commercial data has not only now met the level of national security intelligence data, but actually outpaced it.
Yeah.
And I think that the United States needs to wrap its head around how we think about leveraging the availability of external data. Just because it isn't in DoD's pipelines today doesn't mean it doesn't provide incredible benefit, including to the warfighter.
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably a different panel, but I think the opportunity exists for the United States, kind of to Shyam's point. We could add technology to the level of an instrument of national power. The way we think and talk and teach about diplomacy and military and economic, I would put technology absolutely on that same level, and we ought to really take advantage of that.
I'd really want to double tap General Rainey's point there on how technology exacerbates the differences and kind of creates a risk for, as you called it, the underperformers there. But I see that actually in both government and commercial, where there's this kind of presupposition that technology will somehow help the median person be better. But what I actually see is that the greater the technology, the more important excellent humans become, and that the absolute gap, like if you're going to put a median performer in versus the very best, becomes bigger and bigger. So then you should expect more extreme outcomes in terms of the distributions that happen. It becomes more important to have both technological superiority and the human capital, which is a natural strength of this country, to go back that up.
As is competition. And that's an important aspect of what I think you're talking about too, Shyam. Chris, this is something that you've talked about before, including the idea of competition, not just among the companies that want to play in this space, but how do you think about incentivizing DoD to think in a competitive mindset in order to drive change in the acquisition space and do more?
Yeah, so first I would sort of pin it back. It's not just the acquisition system that is a challenge, right? I think it comes in for a lot of blame and it deserves its fair share. But it's really the totality of that system, starting with the definition of requirements to programming and budgeting to acquisition, authorization, and appropriation of resources. And that system has been set up largely to move in a linear way over a very long period of time to produce large industrial systems. And it's not bad at it, right? I mean, I know the PPBE Commission is working on it, making it suck less, but if they're somewhat successful, that's great. I think the challenge is that is for a certain kind of problem that is very unique. Right. I mean, aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, ICBMs, you're going to develop a small number of those things over a long time. You're going to want to lock your requirements. You're going to have maybe one or two, maybe three companies in America that can build those kinds of capabilities. I think what we're talking about here is the need for a completely parallel process for all of the things that fall into the category that I've referred to in the past as like a Moneyball military, like the things that I can buy faster, that get better faster, where I can buy them at large scales, I can keep multiple vendors competing against one another to really provide industrial flexibility. That's where I think the government needs to think less about how do I manage a sort of fragile industrial base in the absence of competition, and think more about, to Shyam's point, as a monopsonistic buyer, how can I use my buying power to create incentives that generate markets? So those markets are not going to look like the consumer electronics market, but they can look a little less unique and weird than the sort of defense market that we've come to know and love, where things like loitering munitions, drones, a lot of the things that General Rainey has been prioritizing, these are systems that are going to get better from a software standpoint daily and weekly, from a hardware standpoint, probably yearly. And if the government is buying it with that kind of regularity and getting into that type of a process, which is I think what I hear the Deputy Secretary talking about when she talks about Replicator, of a buying practice for this class of military capability, you can actually begin to create markets. You can actually reward new entrants for coming in with something disruptive and useful and getting to scale and production fast. Where you can start aligning much of the investment capital that is out there in capital markets, just looking for good things to do, to back these kinds of companies, to grow their workforces, to develop new technology, scale production, and get this flywheel moving for national defense, admittedly in this kind of class of military systems that are different than the traditional military systems that we've all focused on for decades. But I would contend, equally, if not more useful for generating competitive advantage, on a rapid timeline against, China, Russia, and our competitors.
Yeah, and also speaks to the need to bring in and marshal the American industry. This isn't just the defense space that we're talking about.
And I think that speaks to what I think the capital class needs to continue showing up. These frequent buying opportunities allow companies to succeed at scale. The other part that I think is really important is the point that Arthur Herman's been making, is that innovation follows productivity. So if you're building 10 of these things, you should expect that the more exquisite you are, the lower rate of production you're going, actually you should think that you're structurally capping the amount of innovation that can happen in those sorts of systems. And that the innovation is going to come from, I want 1,000. Next year, maybe I want 2,000. And that's going to force companies and those who are competing for those orders to drive more innovation into the process.
Yeah. There's another aspect of exactly what you're talking about, which has to do with staying close to the end user of these systems and iterating with them. And Chris, you mentioned the requirements process as well. Yes, program offices want very well delineated and detailed requirements. And then they want to be able to give that vendor prime time to go off and build the exquisite system. But I actually think DoD has learned and applied in some cases the reality that that's just a really bad way of operating, frankly, and is starting to take more and more lessons from something that we know very well in the software space, which is a much more iterative process of development. And so how do you extrapolate that model from software development where you're getting that user feedback and baking it into your ongoing system development when you're talking about a capability that's going to be on the battlefield?
Yeah, we're AFC, relatively new organization, 5 years, but one of the indisputable success, and it was really my predecessors, is this idea of soldier touch points, right? So if you're fielding or developing a capability as often as possible without being disruptive because they have jobs, the more you can put that into an actual formation with the soldiers that really do that, the better feedback you get. And that's an idea that we've borrowed from watching and learning the way you operate. A commander with a coder sitting next to each other, can't do that at scale. We're trying. But that's the optimal thing. So that's as applicable if you're trying to build a new tank or any kind of system as it is to software. So we are learning from that. Invaluable. And now, as tragic as wars are, they're also, the optimal place to be learning. And we're doing that same model as far forward as we possibly can.
Yeah, if I could add to that, I mean, I think, it's interesting listening to a lot of folks in industry talk about, digital design and agile development and user-centric development, and, it's all sort of buzzwords and bullshit in corporate initiatives. But, I think when you actually look at it, like, this is just kind of the right way to build certain kinds of technology, right? And I think for us at Anduril, like, this is just how we've been doing it, because why would you do it any other way? So you talked about, kind of open systems and how do you kind of create a constantly modernizing capability. Well, you have to have it be an open system to begin with, right? The software and hardware need to be separate. The payloads in the vehicle need to be separate. You need to be able to kind of bring any capability together to create, what the user is going to need, what the mission is going to require. Because when all of that changes, you're going to have to adapt the system all over again. So it's getting out of this mindset that we can predict the future, we can know our requirements, we can get the right technical solution, and we will be right, and we will be ahead, for years, if not decades. Like, those days are gone. So unless we are developing these things this way, where we are building change and adaptation in at the front, where we're building a degree of humility into the front that we're not going to know what our requirements are. We're going to largely get a lot of these things wrong. And as soon as we figure out what we think the right answer is, the operational context or the technical context is going to change. Like, unless you've architectured your systems to be able to change that way, both from a software and a hardware perspective and an overall architectural standpoint, you're just going to be left behind. So, I think a lot of this sounds like, again, kind of corporate management speak when we hear about it, kind of in the kind of industrial conversations. I mean, for us, it's just like the right way to build technology, and I think the commercial industry figured this out 10 to 20 years ago.
So to add on to that there, I agree with all of this. Is you can think about there's a gulf between how do you create value, which is everything Chris just said, like this is so obviously the right way to be building these things, and then how do you capture that value? And that's the dissonance, because you go to the soldiers, you iterate, you build the thing they want. 2 weeks later, you're building something new because things are changing. But that's not how things are bought or procured. And when I think even, to speak of the programs of record that we've won, after the competition phase, they just want to run the program. It's actually, when I was young and was much brasher than I am now, I thought it's the big legacy primes who are unable to keep innovating. And now I recognize, no, they're just responding to the incentives of what their PMs are saying about, hey, I don't actually want anything new. I already delivered the program, just sustain it. Turn off your brain, stop thinking. And on the other end, you have this whole culture of like, but I have new ideas. I want to feel new things. Soldiers are giving me this feedback. It could be better. And we have to unite the mechanisms that we create value and how we reward that value. It speaks to a lot of things Chris has been talking about, like we need to change the incentive structure of how we run these competitions. The idea in software that you're going to develop something and then you're going to procure it, right. that doesn't make any sense. That's not how the world works. You're just always developing something. So how do we change how we budget and think about and plan for these things so that this is just happening?
And give a voice to those warfighters who are creating the demand signal, because that demand signal either doesn't make its way to the program office, or to your points, all three of you, on incentives not being aligned, they have no incentive to do anything with that demand signal. And yet I think a lot of us in this new class of defense technology companies learned early on that the best way to figure out, do you have anything of value in your product, is go find one of those mission owners who has a pain point and there isn't a PEO doing a damn thing about it.
Yeah, if I could just pull on that. You weren't saying I was BS. Was that me? Okay, I'm just checking. We're good. So let's talk about, like the next level, like what could we actually do about this besides lamenting it? And, General Marshall famously said, when I had the time, I didn't have the money, and when I had the money, I didn't have the time. And I believe we currently have neither time or unlimited amount of money, so we sure as hell better start getting a sense of urgency and outthinking and things like that. So I'll start with the requirements. That's what I do. I'm accountable to our secretary and our chief for Army requirements. I don't approve all of them, but they can't get to those two without coming through me. So through AFC, it's another good thing the AFC's gotten control of. We're trying to do better at it. we have to move to capability-based requirements. A little vignette, if I tell these great people or anybody out there I want a UAV, they're going to ask me, because you can, it's all good at the BD level, but when you get to the engineers, they want to know how much it has to weigh, how far do you want it to go, what color do you want it to be, right? So we are moving to, our company commanders need a 24-hour ISR capability that is attritable, that it comes with a configurable payload, and if it crashes, there's a reason it's unmanned. We're not doing property accountability and flip, and, it's ammunition. It's different, but it needs to come through ammunition channels, not property. Capability-based requirements. The way we're going after the future of our warfighting command and control is commander-centric. Our commanders need to be able to do the following things. And that's really all I tell you. You guys are all in on it. I mean, anybody's welcome, but that's how we're talking. This is what a commander needs to do to beat the Chinese. More decisions, better decisions, faster decisions. We got to plan, we got to prepare, we got to execute, we got to assess. But tell you that, Brandon said problem-based requirements. We'd have way more requirements than we need, but capability-based requirements. And that's totally doable. We've done it. We proved we can do it. We got to scale it. Fiscal agility. We got the money we got, we better be more agile with it. And, if you ask the Army what we need in 24 and 25, I could give you great clarity on the requirement. We have a very hard time moving money inside 2 years. If you go out to 2030, easy to move money, you can start a new program. Really hard to predict what the requirement. So we got to collapse that XY axis down into a little more. And that's not, I think that starts with the Army also. We got to get better. We got to go to portfolio-based, capability-based approaches. Don't have 10 different programs for UAVs. Have a UAV requirement. Negotiate the right level of oversight with our great, we got Congress. They keep us straight. Whatever their tolerance is to move the money, we got to be way more agile. Everybody likes to bag on the acquisition guys. My experience, my partnership with Doug Bush, our AE, I don't blame them for anything. They go out and acquire what we tell them to acquire based on the requirements. They're good teammates. Could they be faster? Yeah, but who couldn't be? And I take ownership of that, but we got to change our strategies. We have the right authorities, but we got to think differently. And, you guys wouldn't compartmentalize any kind of issue, right? That's not how the civilian sector, they build integrated solution teams, whatever you call, whatever the buzzword is these days. But, you can't have a PM here, a different PEO. If 3 PMs got an equity in it, they need to be in the freaking room together. And we know how to do that, and there's, Young Bang was up here. We're doing that in the mission command space. We just need to do it that well between, Picatinny and Warren, Michigan. Contracting, again, everybody likes to beat on the contractors. I think they're great people. We don't have enough of them. We probably could be organized better. If you look at Ukraine, when it's important, our contracting folks have absolutely demonstrated they can go as fast as if the president wants something to happen, contracting works really fast and well. So how do we, figure out the more contractors and having them organized in a way that'll go faster? The whole testing enterprise needs reinvented. Again, great people, it's law, what they do is mandated, but we test UAVs like helicopters, we test robots like tanks, we test software like it's chemical protective equipment. Come on, man. The stuff's unmanned. Yeah. You're going to want something. By the time you get done testing it, these guys, we can't test it fast enough. They've got a better product by the time we're done with the testing. So
that's right.
We need to change the way we test. And then one I'm just still kicking around, and Chris and I have talked about is, the role of integrators. I feel like is still going to be a role, but it can't be the way we do it now. The department has to keep agency, and the days of, picking one integrator and them getting to make the pick between 3 different companies for us is unsatisfying to my desire to always have one human that I can find if things go wrong, but at the same time, you guys got to make money. But I don't believe that's an insolvable problem. It's just going to create a new. So there's 6 easy ones that we could all give way together on and have this thing fixed, because we are too slow. I mean, we need to deter China. We need to put him to bed every single night, deciding that tomorrow's not the day.
That's right.
Because we will prevail, but nobody's winning that war. It's going to be horrific. It's going to fundamentally change our life, and we got to get we got to quit. I'm all for talking, great panel, but we got to get the audio video synced up.
When I hear those 6 points, one of the consistent themes that emerges to me is we got to re-elevate the content above the process. Like, if we're looking for a process to tell us how to do these things, we're going to be pretty disappointed. And we kind of find, contracting goes fast when the president, it's a priority. That's because that's the content, and we're organizing behind it, and we're going to make the process work for what we're trying to get done. And too often we get stuck in a rut where we kind of look to process almost like a god that we're going to follow blindly, and then we get stuck in these ruts.
Right. The framework I think of is a trade-off between resource rigidity and process rigidity. And if your resources are constrained, which sounds a little far-fetched when we're talking about an $800 billion budget, but I get it. It doesn't all go to procurement. But if you're resource constrained, you have to be more flexible on process. And Shyam, I think you made exactly the right point, which is, how do you make it work? You don't run a publicly traded company, multi-billion-dollar business on the commercial side that does go fast because you've abandoned process. You do it by enabling process and making it go fast, to your point too.
Absolutely.
You have to make sure that the process is always serving the content. You obviously can't scale without process, but where you get into a real problem is where the process thinks it is the content.
Right.
And I think that's an important piece of it there.
Don't tell anybody who works in the Pentagon that, because.
If I could just add, I totally agree in terms of like the focus on outcomes. And then the question becomes, are we measuring the right things to know if we're actually being successful? And I think one metric which will probably resonate to many in the audience here is, for years we've now been talking about the need to get non-traditional defense companies, new entrants into the arena, right? Willing to get in and compete and be part of the process. Many have, to our earlier conversation, like we're in a different world than we were 5-10 years ago. I think the question, though, that still needs to be asked, that has not really been answered, is show me how many of them are now performing on large ACAT-1 programs. Show me how many of those companies have successfully kind of crossed the valley of death and are now delivering on large-scale, meaningful production programs. And not all will, not all should. That is the nature of capitalism and government. But unless we can put points on the board and show everyone else who's trying to play this game and get involved, whether it's as a builder, as an investor, or otherwise, that there is a reward at the end of this if you do well, you're going to see that dry up pretty quickly. And I think we're kind of at the point now where there's some initial success, there's some initial good news stories that you can point to, but I don't think we're anywhere close. And unless we can, in the next 12 to 24 months, start seeing real shining examples of success, I think it's going to be pretty demoralizing to people who are genuinely in this game to try to contribute, to try to build a company, build a business, grow a team, and contribute to the mission, which I think is what is most motivating to all of them. But it's hard to contribute to the mission if you can't make payroll and can't, actually get your business to scale.
Absolutely. That is really interesting that you said 12 to 24 months is really the window before either capital dries up or things start to shift, because if you want to win the next big program of record and you have 12 or 24 months to get that notice of award, it better already be underway, because the timeline for that, as as this whole panel knows, is 24 to 36 months.
Right, and sorry, if I could just maybe add another point of urgency, right? Look, I just believe what the government tells me. So if the reality is that, somewhere in the next 4 to 5 years, the Chinese government might decide, or less, might decide to make a move against Taiwan, that's all the time we have, right? And it's not all of that time. It's probably the next 12 to 24 months, or else, if God forbid we are in that crisis, we're going to war with what we have in inventory now. And, like I've seen a lot of those war games. I don't think that story ends well. So it's not just about, getting non-traditional companies to scale. It's that those are the kinds of companies that are actually going to be able to deliver something of value in the time frame that is relevant to the most important problem, the most important contingency that we may have to face. And, when I go back and I look at Gaza and Ukraine, we'll be doing after actions on this for a long time. The sort of thread that I pull throughout them is that they both are failures of imagination. Putin said exactly what he was going to do, and many folks just failed to imagine that that was actually something that was possible. Gaza is still obviously relevant or relatively new, relatively recent, hazard to kind of make predictions about what happened, but a lot of what you're seeing is just a sheer belief that Hamas wasn't capable of this. This isn't something that we have to worry about. So I worry that we get into the same trap of believing that, notwithstanding all of the evidence that's right in front of us, we have more time, we can afford to be more deliberate, sometime in the 2030s we'll get around to fielding the solutions we need. I think there's a time pressure here from an operational perspective, not just from a sort of new industrial base perspective.
Absolutely.
And if I could tie that back to Ukraine and the desperate need to treat that as a battle lab, this ought to be our Lend-Lease moment. The counterfactual for World War II without the 18 months of Lend-Lease would have been devastating for this country. And what we are essentially doing is taking Cold War era kit and donating it over there. That is not, and as a consequence, we're kind of realizing we have production challenges, but we're not doing anything to fundamentally inflect those challenges. And so if we instead said, look, we're going to be taking the stuff we're developing today and testing it and seeing how does it work? How can we learn from it? How can we evolve it? Can our PEOs keep up with the pace of the fight that we should be expecting with all of the necessary caveats, which is that the Ukraine is not the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. But have we stress tested our ability to adapt to the adversary? And we're kind of squandering that moment, I think, at great peril to all the things that Chris just mentioned here.
Yeah, just to pile on that adaptability, which I think that's a skill that we, the Joint Force, especially the Army, we are going to need to be adaptive if and when we fight the next time. Mm-hmm. We are not going to get it right. We'll get it close, but it's going to be about what did we get wrong, who sees it first, and who can adapt. So whenever the war happens, I couldn't agree more that we ought to be using this time to develop an adaptive culture, competency, going fast and figuring out how to do it now, because we are certainly going to need to do it no matter how good we figure out, what our prediction is. If you fight a good enemy, they're going to adapt to us, and it's going to be this constant. The great companies, and I won't name any, but the ones that really make me nervous are the dual use companies. We deal with industry partners that are kind of into going to war business, but companies that don't have to, they're going to make decisions that are in their interest, which is what they're supposed to do. They don't need the department. They could go do it somewhere else. And they happen to be the best ones who have that opportunity, so I say 18 to 24 months. Yeah. 24 and 25, we have got to dramatically increase the pace by which we're adapting.
That point about reliance on government funding or being in a position as a business where you don't need it at all and it might not be worth the heartache is actually an indicator in the arc that the PEOs today are starting to adopt in terms of understanding, as I look not just at my prime, who I know isn't going anywhere, but beyond the prime into the supply base. Where are the companies, not just the ones that might have financial instability and are going away, what are the ones that are just going to throw their hands in the air and walk away? And that can be gotten ahead of. Now, you've got to come back and come up with solutions to entice them back in, which is a big part of the conversation. But spotting them to begin with, preferably before they turn their backs, is certainly the goal. Also, all three of you just talked about the United States going to war with China and put a timeline on it, which is exactly why I wanted to start the conversation with optimism. So, well done.
I didn't put a timeline on when. I said we need to get it going.
I know. and good clarification, sir. Okay, I want to come back and pull the thread on one other thing that you mentioned, but I'm really curious in our industry colleagues' point of view on this. You talked about having a coder with the commander. And I completely agree, and we talked about the value of iterating in the battlefield and being close to the user in any kind of systems development. So 100% yes. My bias would be preferably that coder is not also a government employee, or depending on the situation, someone in uniform, because I think the world's best coders are in the United States, but wearing something else, and specifically are in the private sector. I have observed that if you look over the past 10 to 15 years, I actually think that the Department of Defense has made tremendous progress in moving toward buying commercial software. For a period of time, they did anyway. And over the past 5 years, I have noticed very worrying backsliding on that trend. And where we used to hear people acknowledge, oh, commercial item preference is a thing, and the commercial sector has already built software that does this. Instead, now I'm hearing a lot more vendor lock. Vendor lock, we're afraid of vendor lock, we have to own it all, which is a bizarre shift given that the trend was going in another direction. I'd be fascinated to know, Shyam and Chris, do you see this trend as well? And more importantly, because I do think it's there, why is this backsliding happening?
We're definitely seeing that sort of shift, and maybe the pendulum is still kind of settling and swinging around there. I think one of the challenges is we're almost in some sense talking about the wrong thing. In the commercial world, obviously companies have the same sort of concern, but they really manage it not by talking about vendor lock, but by talking about switching costs. If you're using open source software, you are locked into that software. The real question is, does it take me a day to switch out of that locked in decision, or does it take me a year or a decade? And as a PEO or a PM, just think about it, as the product manager for Palantir's products, when my engineers make decisions, I'm thinking about how do I manage the switching costs that their decisions are creating for me. And I think we would do better by thinking more about that and managing to that. I think the other dimension of this is there's a nuance where of course the government should be able to build its own software, build on top of these things. It needs flexibility. And figuring out a way that isn't this extreme bimodality of either we own it all or it's all commercial, but that actually what I think people care about is that it works. And it works means it doesn't just work today, but that it's flexible and adaptable. And this is where I think we're getting caught up in rigid process that defines flexibility and adaptability rather than empirically measuring, is this flexible or adaptable? And driving the competition incentives around that, making that part of the selection criteria when you're doing it, which is not a paper exercise of, is it MOSA, check a box or something. It's too easy actually for people to check that box, and in fact, it's not open or adaptable. The openness of it is something that's much more empirical. And so I think we're kind of almost having the wrong conversation, which is why we've switched in the wrong direction.
And if I could add briefly, I think a lot of this ends up as a theological debate, where either the government must build it all itself so that it owns it, or just we're going to outsource the whole thing to commercial industry. Government's going to shut up in color, and then we'll just use what you give us. And I think the reality is we end up missing a lot of the creative space in between, right? So I say this, just from an Anduril perspective, we're in the going to war business. If the NFL wants to buy our counter UAS systems, I'm happy to sell them to them. But when you kind of optimize the system for SOCOM, you kind of end up priced out of a lot of the commercial market. So we very much focus on the defense use case, and I think the reality is, in between there, what you're really looking for are software capabilities that are built like and have the performance of commercial software, but are optimized for the very kind of unique military use cases to be able to work under the kind of unique military environments where those softwares are going to be deployed. And you end up having to be quite creative about what that business model looks like, and about IP and ownership and government rights and the like. And I think, echoing General Rainey's point, I think the pendulum did swing for a long time in the sense of government probably outsourcing too much to industry. And it's not wrong for the government to want to have more opinion, more agency, more visibility into how systems are being developed, what the subsystem looks like, have more say over what different modules go into the architecture, while still having that single throat to choke, or that single sort of industry partner who's going to do industry things to deliver at high industry standards. It's just that I think for the defense kind of unique case, we're going to have to be a lot more flexible than either the binary government builds it all or commercial industry builds it all, and the government doesn't have any kind of role to play in that process.
Right. Yeah.
And I think part of the underlying dynamic that isn't talked about enough is that this is a way for companies whose entire business model is purely labor-based to protect their revenue as well, right? Because if it ends up being too much commercial software, there isn't enough labor for the traditional system integrators here, and it becomes a proxy fight where they're using kind of the government's desire to control things, and that's what's denying the creative space in between, which is nobody's, like, just to Chris's point, there is a reasonable amount of control the government does in fact need. But the strength of American technology also means that you're likely going to need more, not less, commercial software. Right.
General Rainey, did you want to weigh in? Or?
Just one last, since we're in the blinking red, one last point, because I really appreciate the audience, and they're spending time. We didn't hit it, but our quest for the aspirational is blinding us to the doable in all these areas. Pick a topic: human-machine integration, UAS, certainly AI. There's a lot of things that might happen, but we are leaving a lot of capability and opportunity unrealized because we're spending our time figuring out what might be able to happen, and we're not taking advantage of what we could absolutely be doing now. And that's just one of the opportunities, since it's kind of getting back to being an optimist. We're not going to pin a Ranger tab on a robot anytime soon, right? But we absolutely should have robots and humans teamed in every formation we have. AI might or might not do something, but if the amount of knowable information that our commanders don't know, we could close 90% of that gap right now with what we could do with AI. So, while we figure out what might happen, just really bringing this technology to bear now would be something that I think we could all work together on.
Yeah, I don't think we're allowed to get off stage if I don't ask the AI question. So thank you for taking us there, and I know we're over time. They have to invite me back next year so I can go back. I can stay longer. So last question on AI, quickly from all three of you. And sir, I think you started to answer it, because what I'm wondering is DOD and is the Army doing enough so that AI has a revolutionary impact on the battlefield, or are we shying away from the capabilities until we feel more comfortable and it's only evolutionary?
No, I think we clearly understand the potential. We're doing the best we can to turn that into capability. There's a little bit of not knowing what we don't know, but we've got all kinds of efforts, everything from trying to educate our work. We need to upskill our force. You're right, most of it's going to be civilians sitting next to military, but there are places there are places where you're not going to get somebody to go unless they are willing to die for it, and so we have to have some capability ourselves. So what I say, my favorite AI theorist is a guy named Sun Tzu, right? Real current, cutting edge stuff, who just said, if you know yourself, you know the enemy, you know the terrain, you'll win 1,000 battles. That applies to the United States. So when it comes to AI, we should be able to know everything about ourselves. The physical terrain is 100% knowable. And if you're in the band of excellence in those two and have a 50% read on what the enemy is going to do or where he's at, the U.S. joint force won't lose. So I would like to see that application at a great speed and sense of urgency while we're figuring out the ethical, moral, what's going to happen. Right. I'm glad there's some smart people working on that part, but I mean, let's go.
Yeah, let's go. Shyam, are we doing enough or too cautious?
I think the part about AI that I think is tricky is when you overly isolate it you can lose the context of it. If you think about a prior era, maybe 5 years ago, there were all these companies who were building models. Most of them don't have businesses that really survived. All the value actually is captured through an integrated workflow that includes what you're doing in the application and the AI. And when that happens, there's something about it, it almost loses a bit of its magic from the outside observer, but it's actually much more useful. And I think that's what you're really seeing in the commercial world as well. All the valuable applications are an elegant integration of the humans in the enterprise, traditional software, and AI. And so I think where we're doing too little is when we just look at it in isolation, we stare at it, we admire it, we wonder if it's safe to use or not, rather than doing what General Rainey was saying, which is, can we get better today? Like, what is doable now that gives us advantage? And by the way, doing that, like, AI is an empirical, experiential thing. You cannot just think about what use cases will be good. You got to actually try it and learn it and develop it. And we got to get busy at getting after that piece of it.
Yeah, just to underscore that, we're not talking about photon torpedoes and cloaking devices here. We're talking about technology that exists. The challenge for government is not how to develop it, it's how to adopt it, which fundamentally goes to what problem are you trying to solve? Right? So we have a lot of these conversations, AI is going to change everything and it's all boil the ocean. Bringing it back to more of a theory of adoption and change, where there are a lot of problems right now that AI cannot solve and shouldn't solve. There are specific things that, just to echo the comments already made, AI ML can make us better today on problems that it is capable of addressing. And in so doing, you begin to build trust. And then you kind of have an ability to kind of scale to the next hard problem. So it's more of a process of change and adoption, more so than it is kind of developing new and novel technology. I'd say that's largely here. It's more of a question of how do we kind of focus on the problems we're trying to solve and then adopt it over time so that it becomes a more and more potent capability for the government.
All right, let's get after it then. Chris, Shyam, General Rainey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.